All right, welcome everybody. My name is Mark Arst. I'm the League of Oregon Cities lobbyist for tax finance and economic development. You're here today for a discussion on the American Rescue Plan Act. We're going to plan to talk for about an hour about all the guidance that's come out on the act, and then hopefully have about half an hour for your questions. You're welcome to drop questions in the chat at any point, or you're welcome to just jump in and interrupt if you want to. There are going to be too many folks for me to see hands go up. So, chat is probably your best bet. But again, if you're not able to do that, feel free to jump in at any time. With us today, we're going to have one other lobbyist from LOC. Jenna, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hey everyone, I'm Jenna Jones. As Mark said, I lobby on telecommunication, energy, and environment issues, so I'll be talking mostly about the broadband investments included in ARPA. Happy to be here. Thanks, Mark.
Great, thanks so much, Jenna. So as always with the Zoom, if you could mute your microphones if you're not trying to speak, and that'll help us out a little bit with background noise. Again, this presentation is being recorded, so cameras on, cameras off, it's all up to you. But just know that presentation's being recorded, and if there's any noise out of your microphone, you'll pop up on the screen. Again, hoping to get to save a good amount of time today for questions. I think that some of you definitely joined us last time we did a talk on the same topic back in May. And so a lot of this is going to be repeated from that previous discussion. I'll try and focus on changes that have come out in the guidance since that time. But I don't think it's a bad thing that a lot of the answers are still the same answers. That's a good thing for us because we don't want things to be moving too much. We have a PowerPoint today, and I'll go ahead and get that up now. All right, and so you should be able to see that now. And if you don't like the view, if it's not a side-by-side view, if you want to make me smaller, that's certainly fine. But you can mess around with those. I think they're generally on the top right side of your screen. You'll be able to kind of change what view your Zoom is in, and so you can kind of get it however you like it as far as the layout goes. Don't worry about taking a ton of notes today. First of all, this is being recorded, so it'll be available for you to watch after the fact. And then secondly, the PowerPoint will also be available after the fact, so don't feel like you have to jot down everything that's on all the slides. So let's go ahead and just get started here. The state and local fiscal recovery funds is the part of the American Rescue Plan Act that we're discussing today. We'll just generally refer to it as ARPA, but I think that most of you know that the American Rescue Plan Act actually does quite a bit more than just the money that cities are getting directly. But just as a shorthand, we'll just continue to call it ARPA like we kind of have been from the beginning. How much is coming to Oregon? We're looking at over $4 billion total between the state, the counties, the cities. But the part that we're more interested in, obviously, at the League of Oregon Cities is the part that's going to the cities, and that's over $680 million. So quite a bit of money that's coming to you folks. And, it's just such an opportunity for us, we know, and we're really appreciative of the work that the National League of Cities did getting us this money. But, this is a real opportunity for generational investments. The guidance encourages you to reach out to your, community members and your residents and talk to them about how they might like to see this money invested. And certainly, I know a lot of jurisdictions are looking at public process for determining how they want to spend the money. It's not required, but it's something that you might want to think about. Another thing you might want to think about is a regional approach on some of this stuff. Maybe you want to do a business support program. Maybe the county wants to do a business support program and you guys can cooperate. Maybe you don't actually have that many businesses in your community, but you know that all the folks in town work just down the road at a business that's had some serious issues. Maybe partner with the county and you guys can do a program where you can get a little bit more bang for your buck and you can be a contributor to their program. So I would think about all of those things as we as you're trying to figure out how you're going to spend this money. Right at the outset, I want to say this is not the Coronavirus Relief Fund program. So if you all recall the CRF program, we had squabbles with the state about how much money cities would actually get. We don't have to deal with that now. The amount of money that you get is set. We'll give you a link to that information, and I think most of you already know it, but there's not really a concern there. Additionally, there's not going to be restrictions on how you use the funds. And probably most importantly, this is not a reimbursement program, right? So CRF, if you recall, you had to spend the money up front, and then you asked for the state to reimburse you for the money that you had spent. That's not how this works. Instead, you'll get all the money up front, and then you'll spend it as you deem fit under the guidance, and then you'll report back to the U.S. Treasury on how you've spent the money. So very different as far as how the program is organized. So how do you get money? How much money are you getting? These are obviously the big questions. So a couple different ways that this works. For larger cities, which are called metropolitan cities in the guidance, these are generally cities with population over 50,000 plus Lebanon. Lebanon's very special. We could talk about that, but we probably won't. But these metropolitan cities apply directly to Treasury. And I hope that all of you all have already gotten your money. The cities that I've talked to who are the metro cities have already received the first half of their funds. But there's a link that'll be in the PowerPoint for how to apply and get that money if you haven't already, but that should probably be taken care of. Now, on the smaller cities, these are referred to throughout the guidance as NEUs, non-entitlement unit of government. And basically that means that you are not an entitlement city under the CDBG program that's run by HUD. So you folks, as you're probably well aware, get your money from the state. So the state received a large chunk of money, they've already gotten it, and then they have 30 days to push it out to you. And then they can ask for another 30-day extension, which is going to be necessary. But there have been a number of emails that have gone out, publications in the bulletin. We've done direct emails to cities who haven't applied. There are still, as of last Thursday, 22 of cities that have not yet applied to get their share of the money through the state. Now, right now we're okay. DAS hasn't given us a hard deadline yet, but there will be a hard deadline, and we expect to hear what that is this week. If cities don't apply by that deadline, your money goes back into the kitty and will be distributed to the other cities who did apply. So you'll be getting a series of increasingly nervous phone calls from me if you have not applied yet. And certainly we'll be sending out more email correspondence. But there's a list on the LOC's website of the cities who, as of last Thursday at noon, had not yet applied. So if you're a city who did apply and you just want to make sure that you're okay, go and check that list and you'll be able to see whether or not you're registered. And that list is under the ARPA Hub, is what we call it. It's the big ARPA link off of the front page of the LOC's website. And then there's a little tab for funding. Just click on that tab and you'll be able to see the list of cities as of last Thursday at noon again. So everybody gets 50% of the money now, 50% of the money 12 months later. The non-entitlement units of government, I just heard today from the first city who has actually received their money through the state. So that's been in the works. DAS sent that list to Treasury over a week ago, but it took a little while to get those funds out, but they should actually be hitting your bank accounts like today, tomorrow. So keep an eye out for that money coming in. So that is how you get the money. And then we have links here to how much money you're expected to receive. Again, on the NEUs, it can change slightly. There's a test. You cannot get more than 75% of your budget as an ARPA grant. So that we don't know of any city who's hit that cap, but it could affect things. And then again, there may be some money that gets redistributed. So things could go up slightly, but we don't anticipate that anybody's allocation is actually going to go down. All right. So what are the requirements for spending money? So when we had the Coronavirus Relief Fund program, there was next to no guidance. It was tough, and the guidance kept changing, which was, I know, a real challenge for you folks. But here we have a lot of guidance, almost too much guidance. I know that a lot of folks are feeling a little swamped, with all the information that's out there. But here are the basic pieces of guidance that we're looking at. We have the interim final rule through Treasury, and that rule kind of It has a big preamble that kind of talks about the COVID crisis and the justification for spending this money. And then it's got specific guidance on how to spend the money. And then at the very end of it is actually the rule itself at the very end of that document. So that is the detailed rule that interprets what the ARPA Act, the actual language in the legislation means. We have the FAQ, the frequently asked questions document. This is a document that's being updated regularly. It's been updated about 6 times already. The last update, I think, was July 14th. And so that document has been updated with some frequency, but it has slowed down recently. And so we might be getting to a situation where we're a little bit, have a little bit better idea of what that, that there's not going to be as many big changes, hopefully, in that guidance. There's also a fact sheet document. If you wanted something, that was just a real high level, what type of things can we spend the money on? You can also take a peek at that fact sheet. And again, all these links will be available in the PowerPoint that we'll post after the webinar. So, one broken record. Something you're going to hear many times today is work with your attorney, right? So there is a lot of guidance out there, a lot of information, and you're going to really need to work with, your counsel if you have specific questions on how you should or shouldn't spend the money. Today, I'm going to do everything I can to help, right? I'm going to share, well, I've seen this in the guidance, and then it points to this over here. I'll tell you what I'm seeing as far as, helping to answer a question. But ultimately, it is a question for you and your attorney, whether or not the guidance allows you to spend on a particular item. The guidance is pretty clear on dates, right? The funds have to be obligated by December 31st, 2024. So you've got time, right? You don't have to spend the money this year. Certainly, you won't even get the second half of the money for another 12 months. But you have until December 31, 2024 to obligate the funds. And then the guidance is even more generous. It gives you until the end of 2026 to actually complete projects. So if you have a big infrastructure project, you obligate the money here in a couple of years, you decide what you're going to spend on, you sign some contracts, you could actually have until the end of 2026 to finish that project. And that's called the performance period for the program. So a couple dates there. You have to have all the money put into its buckets, and you probably want to have like a signed contract to demonstrate that you're obligated by the end of 2024, and then you have till the end of 2026 to actually perform. The guidance says that you can only cover costs, and these are costs to you, to cost the city, through or from March 3rd, 2021 on. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't help out a recipient, right, who had losses or costs prior to that, right? So if, let's say you want to do help for unemployed folks in your community, they could have been unemployed before March 3rd, 2021, and you could still be helping them out for that. Similarly, business assistance. You want to help out some businesses in your community because they had to close down early in, during 2020, say, that's still allowed. The cost has to be a cost to you from March 3rd, 2021 forward. But for a recipient, it's not the same. It could be a cost that they had from prior to that time, or a loss that they had experienced. So something to keep your eye on there. Additional guidance has come out, and this is in the form of a compliance and reporting guide document, and then also a user guide for what they're calling the U.S. Treasury portal. So there are links to these documents again in the PowerPoint, but these documents are really focused on, what do you have to do to stay on the right side of the Department of Treasury? What are your obligations as far as reporting and record retention and those types of things? And there's a little bit of stuff in that you really should give them a good look. Even at the beginning, you may say, well, I'm not reporting quite yet. Why would I need to look? Well, you need to keep track of certain information as you go along so that when the time comes to report, you have that information handy. So it'd really be less work for yourself if you kind of look up front and figure out what it is that you're going to have to report on. So when are reports due? So here's a little chart that comes directly out of the reporting guidance document. And it shows when reports are due. So really, we've got 3 groups that we're worried about here. We've got metro cities with a population below 250 and who received more than 5 million. And you folks have to do an interim report by August 31st of this year. So it's coming right up, right? We're like looking at like a week out basically. And then who received less than 5 million, same thing. You're going to have to do an interim report here within the next week. So that's coming up. And then for other folks, for the smaller cities who are getting their money through the state, you're not required to do that interim report, right? Now, everybody else, now after this, everybody's going to have to do a report by October 31st, and then quarterly for the cities who receive more than 5 million, and annually for the cities who receive less than 5 million, and those, again, those NEUs, those smaller cities who receive their money from the state. So again, we're looking at basically 2 reports that folks are going to have to do. There's a third type of report, but the only folks who have to do that are the city of Portland, because it's only for cities with a population over 250,000. So we're not going to really focus on that today. I think that Portland's well aware of the responsibilities that they have as far as that annual recovery plan. So again, how do I fill this information out? You know, look to that user guide. It's got basically all the fields that you're going to have to fill out when you go in to do this report. Say you're one of these cities who received your money directly from the US Treasury. It's got all the information that you're going to have to fill out on the Treasury portal, so you can kind of get all your information ready before you log in there. And it, you know, has pretty detailed instructions, especially in that user guide, as far as what you have to have there. So, you know, this is all the guidance that's out there right now, basically. You know, I would really encourage folks to, you know, take a look. We'll have a link later to the Treasury's page. I'm sure most of you folks have already looked at this, but there are a lot of other little supplemental documents throughout that thing. There's a template for certain kind of reports that you can find. You know, there are actual webinars that they put out for the various size cities as far as how to do the reporting. There are actual webinars that the US Treasury put together on how to do that. And those, again, those are available on the Treasury's webpage. And so we'll provide a link to that. But basically, when you get to the front page of that page, if you look along the left side, there are just a number of different links, and you can go to each of those links, and it's another page that's got quite a bit of information on it. So I really encourage you to take a hard look at that page. All right. Another thing you're going to want to look at, obviously, is the agreements that you've signed with Treasury or with the state when you took the money. Those agreements are, you know, you should consider those to be guidance as well. You have to follow the US civil rights laws, you know, you have to follow all the, you've agreed to follow all the guidance that Treasury puts out. So those, you know, are obviously responsibilities for yourself. A couple other things from the guidance that I'll point out right at the top. You know, we get a question a lot. Well, you know, can we give this money to a nonprofit to administer a program for homeless folks, say? And the answer is yes. You know, they're considered a subrecipient under the guidance, but you are still very much on the hook for making sure that they actually perform in accordance with the US Treasury guidance. So just because you give the money to a nonprofit to do a certain thing doesn't mean that like your responsibility ends there. You're still going to have to report back to Treasury on what happened with that money, what they did with it, and you're the party that's still responsible for making sure that they spend it correctly. So you'll need to make sure that they sign some documents, right, that say that they understand the Treasury guidance and they're going to follow the rules. So it doesn't get you out of that. If you look at the compliance and reporting guidance, it also cites the what's called the Uniform Guidance and the Single Audit Act. And so, you know, that those are big documents, and we're responsible for following those as well. You know, I think that most of your finance people are going to be familiar with these documents already. You know, if you've taken any kind of federal money, you were likely on the hook for following the Uniform Guidance or the Single Audit Act. But, you know, there are different triggers for what can happen as far as audit action goes. So for instance, if you give more than 50,000 to like a nonprofit to administer a program, there's going to need to be reporting on what happened there with that program. And then if you spend more than 750,000 in a given fiscal year, then that triggers that Single Audit Act. responsibility. So you'll be audited then on how the money was spent. So that information again is all in that reporting guidance. Specifically, it's on page 10 if you want to look at it. But just know that the guidance doesn't end, unfortunately, with these 5 documents that we have links to here. There are other things that are required, and certainly if you bundle this money with another federal program, you're still responsible for following the requirements of that other federal program. So there are other requirements that could kick, but I don't want to scare you, right? I think that I've talked to some cities who have already gotten on and started to look at the reporting on the Treasury portal, and they feel like it's relatively straightforward. It's meant to look a lot like reporting that you would have done to the state on your coronavirus relief funds. You're going to see that a lot of the spending goes into the same buckets that you would have reported to the State Department of Administrative Services when you did that CRF. A lot of times you're just reporting a number. Sometimes there's a text field to describe a program, but you're not allowed to use more than 250 words. So don't get scared off, of this money because there's a lot of guidance out there. We're going to be as helpful as we can, and we really want folks to be able to use this program. And I think Treasury recognizes that, there are different size jurisdictions that are accessing these funds with different ability to kind of get through a lot of administrative hurdles. So what can we spend the money on? There's basically 4 big buckets, right? Public health and negative economic impacts, premium pay to eligible workers, for revenue backfill for jurisdictions that have lost revenue due to COVID, and then infrastructure investments in water, sewer, or broadband. And those are taken directly from the American Rescue Plan Act, the actual federal legislation, and they're interpreted by that interim final rule and then further explained in that frequently asked questions document. If I was starting with something, I would start with the FAQ. It's like, I think it's up to 34 pages now. And these are the questions that they've been asked the most by jurisdictions. So if you have a particular question, there's a good chance it's actually going to be in that FAQ document. And if you're not the person at your city who's directly responsible for administering this program, maybe that's all the detail that you're going to need is what's in that FAQ. So I would kind of be inclined to start there. So we're going to kind of go through the allowed uses, just basically in the order that they appear in the actual guidance itself. Again, we're going to keep it pretty high level here because we want to save some time for questions at the end. But we'll try and give you enough so that you get a real flavor for what's allowed. So what are allowed for public health uses? That's the first use that gets described in the rule. It's the first, the order is the same in the FAQ. So public health uses. So for cities, we think, support for quarantine or health access, communication of health orders, capital improvements, certainly at your city buildings like ventilation, glass. Somebody asked about a walk-up window so that folks wouldn't have to come into the building. I think that would be an allowed use. And then behavioral health, including addiction treatment. But the rule is it's very clear that this is non-exhaustive list. So you might come up with other things that are health related that would still work. The rule also invokes the CRF guidance. Okay, so the guidance that we had for the Coronavirus Relief Fund, it says basically an allowed public health use under the Coronavirus Relief Fund guidance would also be an allowed use under the ARPA program. And if you're looking for that, it's in a footnote in the rule. It's footnote number 41. And it says there are a couple exceptions. So if you remember under CRF, you could claim like 100% of payroll for public safety. You can't do that here. That's no longer allowed. You would have to actually, not necessarily track time, but maybe you have a particular unit whose job it is to go around and break up basketball games at various public parks. I don't know if that exists, but if you did, and they were substantially dedicated to just public health, this group, then you could claim their salary, say. But generally, otherwise, you're going to have to allocate their time between what is COVID related and not COVID related. And that's different from CRF. CRF also allowed cost for issuance of tax anticipation notes, and that's not allowed either. But aside from those two things, Most of what was allowed under the CRF guidance is allowed here. And so if you recall under the CRF guidance, and we got a question about this before the presentation today, if you recall, you were allowed to do technology purchases like computers and whatnot to help public employees to work at home. So we presume that that's still an allowed use because it says all the public health uses from CRF were allowed with the exception of these 2 items, and it doesn't accept that item. So we think that those kind of computer technology purchases, laptops, video conferencing equipment, that type of thing, we think that those are still allowed. We had some cities who set up programs for online permits so people didn't have to come into the building, reduce the chance of exposure. We think that that's still allowed. So, those are some allowed public health uses that might kind of apply. And then there are specific uses that are allowed inside a qualified census tract. And so if you go on the actual census website, you can find the list of qualified census tracts. And these are the low income areas of the state. And in those areas, there are additional things that you're allowed to do. And so that could be like benefit navigators, folks to help people sign up for public assistance. A lot of housing services are allowed outright in a qualified census tract. Lead paint remediation, because kids are at home and and are going to be more exposed to lead at home. Violence intervention programs. They, in those neighborhoods, they think that folks have been disproportionately affected by COVID, and so they want to help them out. And so it could be that it's either the program is actually located in that qualified census tract, or it could be that the program is located in another part of town, but it is for folks who are low income and located in that qualified census tract. That qualifies. Now you can still do these same types of activities, this broader list, outside of the qualified census tract, but you need to do additional justification. And you can look in the interim final rule, for the language that has around that. So, it's not really super specific on what that justification would be. It just says that, with additional justification, you can do these programs outside of the QCT. So that's public health. And then economic support for individuals. So, the guidance kind of gives you a framework for how to determine, who gets it and how much. And on the who gets it, so they have to have a harm that was resulting from or exacerbated by COVID. And it has to be proportional to the harm experienced. And so like unemployment's an example. Maybe they weren't actually made unemployed. Maybe they didn't become unemployed during like the business shutdowns that we had, but maybe they were unemployed before that, but had a hard time still finding a job after those shutdowns occurred. That still counts. It was exacerbated by COVID, even if it wasn't caused by it. So you have to meet that test. And then they want whatever benefit you give them to be kind of proportional to the harm that was experienced. So if you wanted to do direct cash payments, say to low income folks, that's an allowed use under the guidance. But they say, well, look to how much money the federal government gave people, right? In the checks, the relief checks that folks got. Look to that to determine what might be a reasonable amount of money that you could give somebody, and don't give them more than that. It needs to be kind of proportional to the harm that they experienced. So there's a presumption that, unemployed folks, people who are food or housing insecure, or low or moderate income folks were disproportionately affected by COVID. So you can do more things for them with less justification. And then, some of the things that we can do, again, assistance to the unemployed, food, rent, mortgage, or utility assistance, counseling or legal aid to try and keep people housed, and cash assistance, again, with some restrictions. You want to look at the guidance if you're actually thinking about doing cash assistance program. And then again, just like the public health, there's additional things that can be done inside a qualified census tract. Services for homeless, affordable housing developments, housing vouchers, programs to address educational disparities, and additional services for kids. And so again, it's not like you can only do these in a qualified census tract, but if you do it outside, then you need to do some additional justification on why these folks were disproportionately affected by COVID, the clients or the beneficiaries of the program, the recipients. And the guidance talks quite a bit about low income people and the BIPOC community is being disproportionately affected. So you might look there for some clues on the kind of things that you would want to use to justify that type of economic support. Business support is another thing that you can do in this first big broad bucket, again, of public health or economic problems. So you can certainly do, much like what a lot of folks did on the CRF, you can do economic support for small businesses. Again, same test, right? The economic harm has to resulted from or be exacerbated by COVID. So, but pretty much every business in Oregon was shut down for some period of time. So certainly, I guess that's not true, but many businesses were. And so certainly that would be something. And it needs, whatever assistance you give the business needs to be proportional to the harm experienced. They talk about criteria that you can look at, like lost revenue, financial insecurity, closures, lack of credit or disadvantaged communities. But read the guidance. You know, it's not like each business necessarily has to demonstrate their loss. You could do a restaurant support program, and we know that restaurants were shut down, right? And so that could be the justification. And then you could let people apply without asking them necessarily for detailed financial information. So if you're looking at a program like this, you'll obviously be reading the guidance around this area very closely. Some of the things that we kind of pulled out of the guidance that we think cities are most likely to do, loans or grants for payroll or other operating costs, loans or grants for COVID mitigation, like plant changes, maybe you need to spread out your workers, barriers, cleanings, vaccinations, and then technical assistance. So all different things that you can do to support businesses. And again, and one thing to note on the business assistance side is that you'll be publishing a list of the businesses that actually received support. So it sounds like those lists are going to be public lists that you're going to need to have available for folks if they request it at the very least. So keep that in mind. You want to keep everything very, I mean, of course you do anyway, but very much want to keep things on the up and up and very level as far as your processes for who qualifies and making sure that you treat everybody the same. So because that information will be public. Additionally, there's some new guidance that came out end of June that says that you can do help for startups. So even if the business wasn't open when the COVID shutdowns happened, if they're having a hard time getting going now because there's less access to capital, those kinds of things, you can do help to kind of get businesses stood up now so that your folks, so your residents have a job. So something to think about there. Economic support for industries. Tourism, travel, and hospitality gets called out in the guidance as being an industry that you can do quite a bit for. This includes support like for the businesses themselves, support to create an attraction that'll drive business to them, and support for business districts. So maybe you're gonna, beautify your downtown or something like that. Read the guidance. There might be some ways that you're able to get that done. It says that you can do work on facilities that got delayed due to COVID. So maybe you were planning on doing something to your convention center pre-COVID, and then you stopped because you realized that, folks weren't going to be using the convention center. Well, now you can pick that project up again, and that's an allowed use. It calls out a lot of the same things that you might do to a city building, barriers, ventilation, that type of thing. And then it says other industries can also get this treatment, but you have to justify that business was impacted the same way tourism and travel was. And it specifically notes in the interim final rule that tourism and travel, they saw a 24% decline in revenue and a 17% decline in employment. So those would kind of be a couple benchmarks that you might be measuring under other industries against. If you were thinking, oh, well, I feel like, we saw some real hard times in the wood products industry, or we saw some hard times in, a high-tech industry, you would want to kind of look and see, did they really get impacted as heavily as tourism and travel, if you wanted to kind of go down that road. Again, some more on economic support. Something that I've been having a lot of conversations with cities on is there's some language in the guidance that rehiring public sector staff to pre-pandemic levels is also considered an economic support expense. So that's obviously huge for us, right? So maybe you laid off a bunch of parks employees, right, at the beginning of this thing, or and you want to rehire now. You can actually cover their salaries in whole based under this guidance. So how long can you pay their salaries? Well, I think through the end of December 2024 for sure. because that's the end of that obligation period. But arguably, if you obligate it then, you could almost do it till the end of 2026, but I would really want to work with my counsel on that. I think December 2024 is much safer. And what does it mean? So let's say I laid off parks people, but I actually want to hire a police officer, say, and this was an actual question that came to us. This is not something that, is just theoretical. If you actually look at the guidance in the interim final rule, it says hiring local, and I'm going to try not to read too much to you today, but I think this one merits it. Hiring state and local government staff, payroll, covered benefits, and other costs associated with the recipient, increasing the number of employees up to the number of employees that it had employed on January 27th, 2020. So it doesn't sound like they have to, it's like you're looking at the pay that went out. You're looking at the number of FTEs that you had as of January 27th, 2020. And so if you lost a bunch of your parks folks, but now you want to hire police, it seems to me, and again, work with your attorney, but it seems to me that that would be allowed based off of that language in the interim final rule. And if you're looking for it, it's section 35.6B in that interim final rule. And you're always welcome to email me to get, a direct link to any of the guidance that I talk about today. So that's definitely one to think about. There are certain uses in economic support that are called out as not being allowed, and some of these are not allowed under any of the guidance, but it says generally infrastructure is not going to qualify, general infrastructure under the economic support, unless possibly if it was like to do affordable, like the infrastructure to get an affordable housing development going in a qualified census tract, then maybe it could, but you can't do, big road project, say, call it an employment project and count it as economic support. That doesn't work. Payment of outstanding debt or fees or cost to issue new debt. We're going to talk quite a bit more about the debt provisions when we get to a little bit later in the presentation, but here it says you can't pay off old debt. You can't pay settlements or judgments, and you can't use this money to replenish your rainy day or reserve funds. So that is called out. Even if you spent your rainy day or reserve funds, back in 2020 to help out with economic support, you can't go back and replenish them now because, again, this is only supposed to cover your costs from March 3rd, 2021 forward. And so they won't allow you to do it. So that's the first big category, public health and economic effects of the pandemic. Second big category, I'm not going to belabor it, is premium pay for essential workers. There are restrictions around this, restrictions on how much the folks can get, restrictions on how high their pay can be relative to the state or county average annual wage. So if you want to do this, you'll need to look at those restrictions, but just know this, that the ARPA understands that our grocery workers, our nursing home workers, our cops, whoever, they put themselves out by getting out there, in the height of this pandemic, and they put their health at risk so that we would be able to buy groceries and so that, older folks would be taken care of and all the other things that are necessary, and we can give them a little bump now to reflect what they did back then. It doesn't even have to apply to folks currently. It can just be a thank you for what they did previously. So, if you're interested in doing something like that, it's completely allowed. It's one of the big four categories. So it's not it's not out there. It's one of the big four categories, and it's something that you're allowed to do. Next category, this is the third one, is revenue replacement. So this is one that I know a lot of states are looking at very hard. It's kind of complicated, but it is not rocket science, and you guys can make this work. But basically, what ARPA says is that you can use this money that you're receiving for general government services to the extent that you experienced a loss in revenue related to COVID. So we'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like exactly, but I'll just say, this loss has to be calculated citywide. You don't look at each individual revenue source and say, oh, Measure 110 really dinged me on my marijuana dollars and I lost money there, but I made it up over here on my lodging tax. And so, I want to still claim a loss. No, you have to look at all of them added together. Did you experience a loss or not? And we'll talk a little bit more about what revenue is included, but generally, it includes most of the big revenue sources that you're thinking about. So I think it would include your property taxes, your lodging taxes, as far as I know, it would include your state share revenues are included for sure. I think it would include your franchise agreements and that type of thing. I've had some questions. Does it include our airport revenue? The city owns an airport. Yeah, that's included as well. We looked that one up. Does it include system development charges? We had a question on that at the beginning. SDCs in most states are called impact fees. And yes, impact fees are included. So you have to include those. So it could be that, you're a city, you lost a lot of revenue, but you actually had a ton of building going on at the same time. Everybody wants a house now that they're not able to go out anywhere. Everybody's focused on kind of nesting. Well, that's going to cut against any loss that you would have otherwise shown because those SDCs are included. You cannot include what they call public utility revenue, but it's kind of limited. So you cannot include the electric, gas, which we don't really do, but you cannot include water as a revenue source, even though we know that a lot of folks have lost a lot of revenue through their water billings. And you cannot include mass transit if you operate a mass transit system. But what can you include, even though it says don't include utilities, you still can include storm and sanitary is still an allowed type of income, general revenue, they call it, that you can include. And so, that can still be included. Yeah, go ahead. Oh, maybe not. If you have a question, feel free to jump in. All right, we'll keep going. Local gas taxes, yes, you include that. Parking fees, we've looked at that. Yes, you include that. So there actually is a new document, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit, that is on the last page of the FAQ. That's kind of a breakdown, and don't try and read this. I know I'm like testing you here, but it's kind of a breakdown of what revenue is and is not included in that revenue loss calculation. And so that would be the first place I would look, and you're going to see that a lot of the questions that you might have about what to include or not include is right there. So what is the actual calculation look like? What you're comparing is your previous 12 months as of 4 dates, right? So December of 2020. So basically calendar year 2020, calendar year 2021, calendar year 2022, and calendar year 2023. You're comparing the 12 months prior to each of those dates to the fiscal year prior to COVID. So you're talking about the actual, basically what your budget looked like pre-COVID, right, is what they're trying to figure. And then you take your budget pre-COVID and you trend it, right? And so in that first one, you're not trending at 12 months, you're trending at 18 months. And you can either use your actual revenue growth that you had seen over a 3-year period pre-COVID, or you can just use a 4.1% number if you hadn't really seen that much growth to that point. But you do what they call this counterfactual line. And so if you look at this diagram here, what we're talking about as far as the loss goes is that gray area of each of those 4 bars. And that's basically free money. You can use it for almost anything. We'll talk about the restrictions, but you can use it for provision of government services. So you could use it to pay your police payroll up to that level. You could use it to pay, just literally your park. You could just pay it for your regular operating expenses on your parks or your libraries or anything like that. So that money can be used for any general government services to whatever extent you suffered a loss in revenue. There's a calculation that has to happen. Here's the actual, straight from the rule. There's the actual calculation there. That second line is what you'll come up with. If you go on the NLC's website, they have a revenue calculator where you can just punch in all your inputs and it'll tell you how much the loss is. So that's an option for folks as well. So what can you use that revenue replacement for? So we're going to talk about infrastructure in a little bit. You can only do water, sewer, and broadband. But you can use this general revenue replacement to do transportation projects, right? Because that's just a general government service You can use it for cybersecurity, environmental remediation. You pay your police and fire payroll. What can you not use it for? Some restrictions that are pretty much common across the program. Can't use it for payment of outstanding debt or fees or cost to issue new debt. You can't use it to pay settlements or judgments, and you can't use it to replenish rainy day funds, kind of what we heard on the economic support program. So this is basically, your free money. Are cities seeing this loss? Some of them are, some of them aren't, right? I've seen some cities where, they've said, well, we didn't actually experience that much loss because we had too much building and our SDCs were super high. I've seen other cities where they say, yeah, nobody's going to work, so our parking revenues are down so much, we've got tremendous loss. So it really is going to be city by city, whether or not you are able to show a significant loss. But if you do have a loss, then that is basically, you have a lot of leeway on how you use those funds. So that was revenue replacement. Next up is infrastructure, and we're doing pretty good on time here. So on infrastructure, again, it's water, sewer, and broadband. So on water and sewer, the guidance says that you have wide latitude on how to, how you want to prioritize the projects that you might want to do. You can do privately owned projects, interestingly. They talk about what they might prioritize, health, environmental safety, and projects to help the most households. But, you can look at your own criteria if you want to. The real requirement is that whatever you do on the water and sewer side has to align with the EPA Clean Water State Revolving Fund and or the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund, whichever is applicable. And if you go into the FAQ document now, they actually have links to EPA handouts on what qualifies under those programs. But it's all the things that you would expect for a water or sewer project. It includes the planning, it includes the engineering, it includes distribution, it includes a new treatment plant, it includes repairs, it includes maintenance. So quite a bit of stuff qualifies under those two programs, but that's really the hard requirement. It would have had to have qualified for those programs if you would apply for it. Now, how do you know if it would have qualified? It's up to you. It's up to you to determine based off of the information that you see on the EPA website, whatever other information you have out there. It's up to you to determine whether your project would have qualified for one of those two programs. And if it would have, then it qualifies for a use of the ARPA infrastructure dollars. So we kind of have laid out here, some of the things that qualify. There's some language in here about using this money as a match. And so you'll see it in a few different places, but basically, say you actually did want to apply for, this is confusing, right? So it would have had to have worked for the Clean Water State Revolving Fund, but you're not actually using the Clean Water State Revolving Fund, right? You're going to use your ARPA dollars to pay for this project. But what if you wanted to do both, right? What if you wanted to use ARPA for some of the expenses and you wanted to also apply for the Clean Water State Revolving Fund? The guidance is clear that you can't use this federal money, this ARPA money, as your local match under the rules in the Clean Water State Revolving Fund. So you would have to still come up with a local match. You can't use this for your non-federal match on other grant programs. And so it basically says that you look to the individual programs to determine what their requirements are. So FEMA maybe will be a little more lenient, I'm not sure, but certainly a lot of federal programs say that you can't use federal money as your local match. So keep an eye out for that. All right, broadband, Jenna's going to tell us a little bit here.
Yeah. Hi, folks. So I just want to level set really quickly and talk about what broadband is according to the FCC, because some of us will get kind of particular about speeds and things like that. So according to the FCC, the definition of broadband is a minimum of 25 megabits per second download speeds and 35 megabits per second upload speeds. So everything is measured in speeds. And then there are various ways to provide broadband, all of those including DSL, fiber, wireless, cable, satellite, and that's all going to come into play when I start to break down the guidance. So projects that are eligible under ARPA should improve or establish broadband service to unserved or underserved populations to reach an adequate level to permit households or people who are working from home to attend school that are unlikely to be met with private funds. And this really gets to the unserved folks, are defined as those places that lack reliable wireline connections to capabilities of at least 25.3 megabits per second. So the speeds, the definition of broadband as it stands right now. So let's break that down. Wireline, it has to be a wire. Mark, can you go back a slide? Thank you. So what is wireline? So wireline technology is not your wireless antennas, and it's not low Earth orbit satellites. So sorry, SpaceX, this is not your project. The technology they're looking for that are eligible are fiber and mostly coax cable, DSL, but then we're getting hyper technical, but those are what you're looking for, things that can be put in the ground or hung up on poles, attached by a wire. Next, underserved and unserved. It doesn't mean that your whole project only has to serve unserved and underserved populations. It just has to include them inside that project, but it doesn't need to only service them. So if there's a couple of businesses or households that are within that project territory, that's fine. And then the next one, what is reliable? Treasury actually came out with some guidance on what reliable actually means. They clarify in their FAQ that it was meant to give significant discretion to cities. So really what that means is that you have consumers who have actual experience with not getting 25.3, even if it's advertised by a provider that they are getting 25.3. If you know some things about broadband, the 25.3 standard is an up to standard, not a must hit this standard. So if you have consumers who have done speed tests on their web browsers and things like that and can dispute that evidence, even if a provider says they provide 25.3 to that household, you can go ahead and serve them if you would like, and that would be an eligible project. The FAQ also suggests just using other assessments and data sources. There's the FCC data, which there's a lot of flaws with that, but it's allowable. There's Microsoft data. There's a lot of different data and speed test ways to test what your residents are getting at their houses when you're trying to connect them. So as long as you have something as a justification, it should be an allowable expense. Okay, Mark, we can go on to the next slide. Okay. So more of what these eligible projects have to do. So now that we've figured out what unserved, underserved is, why we need it wireline, and what reliably is, and what makes a project eligible to go in and do it, all of the projects must provide 100 service. So this is speeds again, so 100 upload and download speeds. Unless there is some reason like geography, topography, Oregon is very beautiful and has lots of trees and sometimes cliffs and things like that, which are hard to build. And if that makes an excessive cost or that kind of issue, then the service has to be 100 download speeds and 20 megabit speeds upload speed. So and it needs to be scalable for the future to 100. So we're looking at significant gains in the speed of broadband for the projects that ARPA is trying to incentivize. The rule also encourages, but does not require broadband infrastructure projects to prioritize investments in fiber. Like I said, wireline, but fiber is one of the fastest things that you can, or fastest speed bearing cables that you can put in the ground. It wants you to avoid locations with existing agreements to build reliable wireline service, but that's to address some of the overbuilding concerns. But again, it is encouraged, not required. And then it wants you to focus on projects that achieve last mile connections. However, I will mention here that last mile connections, meaning where the consumer then plugs in their device to get internet or their house, is not the only type of infrastructure that you can have. You can have middle mile infrastructure. So that's the backhaul. That's bringing a link to a community, not necessarily servicing particular businesses. The FAQ goes into that, but middle mile projects are allowed, but they would like you to focus on the actual people and last mile connections. Consider ways to integrate affordability options into your program design. We'll get into that in the next slide a little bit. And then this was a good win for cities, especially that the rule encourages folks to prioritize support for community-owned broadband networks, or those who are owned by people who have less pressure to turn profits. So municipal broadband networks. I know there are a handful in Oregon who own their own broadband networks. I know cooperatives, electric cooperatives are getting into that game. People who are not the big corporations are really encouraged to be people you partner with. So next slide. So this is some stuff that was not necessarily super explicit in the rule itself, but became more explicit in the FAQ. So allowable expenses are broadband planning. That's a big thing. If you're trying to do any broadband plan or even future stuff and get eligible for future federal dollars, you need to have a broadband strategic plan. You need to do some like base level engineering. All of those costs for broadband infrastructure projects are eligible uses of the fund. So if your city is not ready to put fiber in the ground, I would really encourage you to start the planning process because that can take years and that will put you a step ahead the next time funding comes around. The next thing is digital literacy and inclusion. So while the interim rule doesn't explicitly say anything around digital inclusion, in the broadband section, they do talk about negative household impacts, and that also includes internet access or digital literacy assistance. So this is you providing, laptops or low-income programs for internet or subsidies for internet service or devices or how to use said devices. So the FAQ notes that this is an eligible expense as well and really hammers in on that, that digital literacy programs and any program to promote internet access would be eligible. Lastly, cybersecurity, Mark mentioned this earlier, are not in the broadband infrastructure investment section, but it's a huge part as we become a more digitally integrated society that we need to be a secure society as well. So cybersecurity activities, including hardware, software, and protection of critical infrastructure are all eligible under the provisions of the government services category, like Mark said earlier. So next. I just wanted to touch on this. So what we've been talking about for the majority of this webinar has been the state and local recovery funds. There's also another fund within ARPA that has to do with broadband. And so that's the Capital Projects Fund. This is a separate $10 billion fund. And it's just going to states. So the Oregon legislature actually appropriated $120 million of the capital projects funds from the ARPA to Business Oregon for broadband in House Bill 5006. So there's still rulemaking around that, how they're going to divvy out the money, how that is eligible and how that fits in with the overall ARPA guidance. But I wanted to give you a heads up on this. It was really to give states, territories, and tribal governments the ability to carry out critical capital projects that would, enable digital work, digital education, telehealth, all of the everything during the public health emergency. And the focus on these funds, while there's not a lot out on them, is to complement the state and local fiscal recovery funds when it comes to connectivity and broadband. And I think that was my last slide, Mark.
Awesome, thank you. So appreciate it, Jenna, and we'll have an opportunity to ask Jenna questions at the end if you care to. So a couple of things that are not allowed under the guidance. Pension deposits are specifically called out as not being allowed. Now, just so you know, if you're paying someone's payroll and as part of the normal pay would be a deposit into PERS, then that is allowed. You just can't make special payments to pay down your PERS UAL, say. So that is called out in the guidance as a not allowed use. Another one, you're not allowed to offset tax cuts. So if you reduce your city revenue on your own accord, that is going to reduce the amount of money that you receive under the American Rescue Plan Act. So that is something you really have to keep an eye on. This is more of a problem for the state. And if the state makes a change that trickles down to you, that doesn't count against you. But if you decide, say, to have your parking fees, or if you decide that you're going to not levy your full property tax rate or something along those lines, that would count against you, and you might have to return ARPA funds. You would get to look at, had you done another increase in taxes over here that accounted for that? And if you had, then maybe you won't have to return any money, but there's a possibility that you would have to return some money. So be very careful about giving tax breaks right now. All right, some outstanding issues that we've heard about. What happens when businesses repay economic support loans? If the loan gets repaid, right, before the end of the performance period, you can then take that money and you can roll it into another allowed use under ARPA. But if the loan that you're giving, say a business or an individual, doesn't get repaid until after the deadline for using the ARPA funds, then we have a problem, right? Under CRF, you would have had to return that money to Treasury. Here, as I read the guidance, and it's FAQ number 4.11, if you're looking for it, it looks like you're not actually allowed to use the ARPA money for the principal of the loan. You can only use it to cover the lending cost, which they kind of outline how they determine what that is. So something to keep an eye on there. I'd be very hesitant to do loans with this ARPA money. Probably better to do grants, or if you're going to do it, make it a real short-term loan that gets repaid and then roll that money over into another allowed use. A question that I've gotten a ton is around like infrastructure projects and debt, right? So there's a lot of requirements in here. You cannot use this money for new debt. But the guidance does say, and this is FAQ 4.10, 4.10 if you're looking for it, that you can kind of, use this as, you can use ARPA as a part of your capital stack, and then you could still do, say, bonding to do a project. So there are ways to make that work, but you have to be very careful that you're kind of keeping, the items separate. So maybe you only use ARPA for a portion of the project, and then the balance of the project is what actually gets bonded. And so you basically would consider it two separate projects, and one of them is funded by ARPA, and maybe one of them is funded by some other source. But you just want to be careful if you're commingling that you're not using ARPA to pay for fees for new debt. That's something you have to keep an eye on. Another question that I've got again and again is, hey, we want to get a project in the ground right now. Can we take out a short-term loan and then repay it with ARPA? That's a good question. And, something that, we've struggled with a little bit over here. And I don't think that the guidance is super clear. This is definitely a talk to your attorney kind of question, but it seems like it may be possible. And again, I'm not going to read to you too many times, but I will read you this. And this is from page 11 of the interim final rule. It says, the eligible use category would not include payment on interest or principal on outstanding debt instruments. Okay, so no old debt can be paid off. You can't pay off the principal on an old loan. Then it goes on to say, payments from the fiscal recovery funds are included to be used prospectively, and the interim final rule precludes use of these funds to cover the cost of debt incurred prior to March 3rd, 2021. So it sounds like loans that you may have taken out, little bridge funding now until you get your ARPA money, say you're waiting for the second tranche 12 months from now. It sounds like that might be a little bit different. There it says, fees or issuance costs associated with the issuance of new debt would also not be covered, but maybe you could pay off the principal. So you take out a little bridge loan now, you have some fees that are associated with that, interest and the origination fees. You cannot use ARPA for that. Can you use it to pay the principal? I think there's a good argument that you could, but this is really a work with your attorney question, and definitely reach out to me if you're looking at doing that. But again, a few of you have asked me this question, so we're putting it in here. We talked about the local match issue. Really, you have to look to the requirements of the other federal program, and you often will not be able to use ARPA as your local match on another federal grant program. The tax cuts, we just talked about that. You can't use this money for tax cuts. An outstanding question that I have is, what about like an enterprise zone program? It is both a state law that this tax break exists, but you are also doing an administrative action in signing the EZ agreement. So if you're signing EZ agreements, I would be a little careful right now, and I would really work with my attorney, work with your finance folks, and think about what that means. Are you giving someone a tax break, and would that require the return of some ARPA funds? Again, if you have more taxes coming in over here, that would balance out, and then you wouldn't have to return any money to the federal government, but definitely something that you want to look at. A couple other questions that I've gotten. NEPA, National Environmental Protection Act, does it apply? No, doesn't apply to ARPA funds, but if you're using some federal funds from another source, it could be triggered there. That's FAQ 6.4. Prevailing wage, is prevailing wage required to be paid? The ARPA funds are not subject to Davis-Bacon, which is the federal prevailing wage standard. but it says that the state prevailing wage standards, which they call baby Davis-Bacon, still may apply. And so you're going to want to look just like you would for any project, whether or not this is considered a project that would trigger prevailing wage. And I think that there's a possibility that it may. Now, your attorney may feel different about this. They may feel like that's a restriction that the state can't put on your use of funds. But I think that's a little, my opinion, that's a little tenuous. But that is between you and your attorney. But I don't think that this necessarily gets you out of paying prevailing wage. Certainly, you don't have to pay the federal prevailing wage, but you may have to still pay the state prevailing wage. I got a question about roads in the sewer project. We can only do water and sewer infrastructure, but we're going to have to tear out the road and put it back to do the line replacement. That isn't allowed use, and that's in FAQ 6.15. But if there's like a big transportation project and the storm sewer is just one little part of it, don't think you get to do the entire project as a storm project. It would just be that part directly related to the storm facility. And you're going to need to kind of break out the components. Another question I've got again and again is parks. Can we spend this money on park improvements? There's some new guidance that just came out on that 2.18. And it says that you can do parks in a qualified census tract. You can do business assistants, patios, and facades it talks about, which isn't really a park in my mind, but they put that under the park guidance, again, in FAQ 2.18. And then they also say that that increased use of the pandemic has hampered the ability of the governments to provide services. Particularly parks have been like super heavily used during this thing. And so you might be able to do it as an economic support program under that. And that quote is in page 11 of the FAQ. And so if you're thinking about doing park improvements, take a look at that guidance in 2.18 and it may answer your questions. All right, trying to move really quickly here to questions. So again, we'll have links to the key resources. Look at the Treasury page first. That's where all the real information lives, the things that you really have to focus on. LOC's got a page that we update pretty regularly. It's just like 5 or 6 pages. We call it our hub, but it's there. And then the NLC also has a hub, and you can go there and you can see what information they've put forward. Certainly you can contact Generai if you have specific questions. I answer these questions all the time, and I'm happy to do it. So, all right. So let's kind of get into questions. I'm going to start off and try and knock out a few from the chat here. First off, I'll note that if you have not applied for your ARPA money yet, Matt Zook is after your money. His first question is, how much money is outstanding? Because that money, again, could get redistributed to other cities. So I don't know exactly how much money is outstanding, Matt. I know there's 22 cities. Most of them are smaller. And so it's probably not a tremendous amount of money. But we really want every city to use their ARPA dollars. This is $222 per resident that you get to help your residents. And so we're hoping that everybody will use it. We got a lot of cities who have reported that they received their check today. That's great. I know that folks had really been waiting, and it's good to hear that the money finally actually got out. Will the funds require any special reporting in our annual audits? I don't know. That's a good question, Stephanie. Maybe one for you to think about. I think that you're definitely going to have a statement, right, about how you're using this money and that you're going to be following the guidance. When you sign those agreements with Treasury, you're putting yourself at some liability. But I'm not really an expert on audits, so I can't really talk too much to that. Emergency radios for fire and rescue considered infrastructure. I don't know. That's an interesting one. I'm not sure that it would be. That's maybe a talk to your attorney question. But maybe, I know that some folks have done like turnouts, which is the outfit that a firefighter would wear. And they've said, well, we don't want them all wearing the same clothes. And so we want them to have their own turnouts. And so if the issue was that you didn't want people to be sharing equipment, arguably, you could make a case there, but not a slam dunk. Are the categories for spending the same for the state as they are for locals? Yes, they are. And Nancy Brewer is looking at the $240 million that the legislature allocated out and whether or not that meets the ARPA requirements. And I'll tell you what, the state's looking at that as well. Some of those projects are not going to qualify that different legislators had allocated to, and they're going to have to find different things to spend that money on, most likely. So yes, the state is held to the same requirements for spending ARPA dollars as local governments are. The allowed uses are narrow, they seem difficult. Remember that these are including but not limited to. So these are not the only like 6 things that you can spend on. These are broad categories to kind of get your thoughts going about how you can spend. And certainly this is not an exhaustive list, right? So you can do other things, but you would want to use the same logic that they used to come up with the examples that they give you in the rule. And the rule will almost always say including but not limited to. So don't feel like these are the only allowed uses. And again, you don't have to spend this money tomorrow. So you got a few years to think about this, right? And I'm pretty confident that every city is going to be able to spend their allocation. Air purifiers in offices, and infrastructure removal or replacement that's previously been abandoned, but it's now creating other issues. Air purifiers certainly, I think, would qualify, as a public health need. And then, other changes at the office. We've seen people talk about spending money to spread out their workers. So somebody wanted to finish out an unfinished area of a building so that they could give everybody more space around their desks. And so those are the kind of things that cities are looking at right now in that capital improvement kind of area. Any good summaries of the non-local dollars that the state or counties have available to them? There is some on the LOC website. There are some description of what's in the ARPA program, and then the NLC also has a summary of the ARPA Act writ large, not just the state and local fiscal recovery funds. So I would look there. Okay. Kevin said that the state will tell you if they would qualify for an allowable use under the Clean Water State Revolving Fund or the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund. So that's interesting. Maybe you can reach out to, I guess it's DEQ who does one, and I think, I'm not sure if OHA does the other. So maybe you'll be able to reach out to them and they'll be able to tell you whether or not the project for infrastructure you're looking at would qualify. SDCs are eligible, but utility revenue isn't. Yeah, I know. I didn't make the rules. I don't understand why water is not included. It's disappointing. It certainly is one of our biggest revenue losses is from not shutting folks off. We've had big users who have gone offline. So water revenues are really down, and we don't get to include that as a part of the revenue loss calculation. Sale of land. Susan, if you want to tell us what that means. Be careful if you're doing, Matt points out the calculation is kind of complicated. I made a big joke about this the last time I did it, and it wasn't actually a joke. I had to look at a 5th grade math website to figure out how to do the order of operations on the calculation of lost revenue, because there are parentheses, there are brackets, there's multiplication, addition, there's exponents. And there's an order of operations that you have to do when you do any algebraic equation. And it's like, I remember first, outer, inner, last from my days in algebra class, but I had to look this up to actually make sure that I was doing the calculation correctly. But again, there is on the NLC website, there's a template that will show you how to do that. And here we go. Kathy says that the GFOA has a really good tool. So that's another one who you might look to for the tool. I wouldn't be surprised if it's the same one that the NLC just borrowed. All right. Funds for low-income housing. We could look into that a little bit more for sure. I haven't given a ton of thought to it, but I will just tell you that inside, again, a qualified census tract, or if the project is serving residents who reside, I guess currently in a qualified census tract, that affordable housing is called out as one of the allowed uses of the ARPA funds. And so there's not a lot of detail in the guidance, I don't think, beyond that. But certainly I would, if you want to find where that is, and this goes for anything that we talk about today, right? You can just go into the interim final rule itself, right? The actual document, hold down Control and hit F for find, search for the word housing, right? Or affordable. And you'll see every time that word appears in the guidance, the rule or the FAQ. And so you can look at what exactly is in there, but it's definitely in a qualified census tract. They call that out as an allowed use. And it's not just affordable housing, it's rent vouchers, it's things to keep people from becoming homeless, right? So it could include like counseling, or maybe, I mean, I think it could include paying off old debt possibly that folks have accrued. We know that the eviction moratorium is going to have to end at some point. So something to think about there. If you sold a property, is it part of the revenue calculation? Oh, I'm going to hedge on that one. Actually, Susan, that is, I think that there is specific guidance, and I can't recall exactly what it says honestly right now, and I don't have time to look it up. So, I think there is a question about disposition of assets, but certainly I would start with that one page, the chart that's at the end of the FAQ. I would start with that and see if it's on there. But if not, I think that there is some specific guidance about sale of assets. I want to say they're included, but do not take my word on it. But that would be a weird one, wouldn't it? Right? Because that's something that just happens every so many years. And why would it count against you or for you? But yeah, it may. All right. Can council give a $5,000 stipend to each of our city employees? No. But you can give a $5,000, well, maybe not five, right? It might have to be less than that. You have to think about, what makes sense, what's reasonable and proportional. But you can do pay for essential workers. So if these were people who were not, and there are standards around this, right? So if you telecommuted like I did during the, kind of height of the COVID crisis here, no, I can't get essential worker check. I feel like I'm essential, but at the same time, I didn't have to have direct, contact with the public. I wasn't involved in the transfer of goods, right? I didn't touch stuff that other people were touching. And there are a number of standards around that. So it's not just any city employee, but certainly you can give, it's possible that you may be able to give some essential worker assistance to some of your city employees. Now you have to look at how much they're getting paid now, where that compares to the state or county median wage. You have to make sure that you don't give them more than, a bump that would take them above a certain level. So there are some real restrictions around all that. You got to be very careful. But yes, there is some possibility to do essential worker pay. DHS and OHA can let you know if a water project is eligible, and that's good to know. So questions, we're open right now for questions. We've been getting a lot of them in chat, and I think I've hit them all so far. But if anybody wants to, share an experience that you've had, has anybody actually gotten in and done their first interim report in the Treasury portal and gotten it complete? That's a question I have. And how did it go? Somebody says yes. Oh, look at you. You're like ahead of the game on everything. So that's great. And I hope it wasn't too traumatic. Some of the folks I've talked to have said that they felt like it was relatively straightforward. And again, you think that they're going to ask so much information, but a lot of times they just want a number. And if you haven't spent any money yet, it's a zero is the number that you put in, right? I haven't obligated any of these funds yet. None of these funds are spent. You still have to do the revenue calculation for the December 2020. But if you haven't spent the money yet, then put in, we may use some of this money for revenue replacement, but we haven't spent any of it yet. Will the slides be downloadable? Yes, they will. We'll have this, and the links will be active. And additionally, so that we'll make sure that gets posted probably Friday at the latest.
Hey, Mark, I had one thing to kind of add in here. When you're talking about, we have till 2024 to obligate and 2026 to do the performance period. One thing, especially in the broadband front that I've talked to many providers about and various cities about, just note that engineering staff, contractors, anyone who does planning work around at least broadband infrastructure, but I'm going to gander that it's going to be pretty similar with water and sewer infrastructure. There's just a giant backhaul both with professionals who do the work and materials to get the work done. So if you have something, while you have a lot of time, I wouldn't be super anxious, but be alert that there are, at this point, especially on the broadband side and telecommunication side, it is at least a year behind schedule till things are going to even be doable to get materials to do projects. And it's only going to get worse. So I just kind of wanted to throw that out there as just a realistic picture when it comes to some of the professionals that need to be hired to do all this great infrastructure work. and that cities should expect some of those delays.
That's a great comment. I've heard that from some other folks too, right? We have this big infrastructure package coming. There's going to be a shortage of folks who are willing to, are able to do engineering on projects. And so, maybe you want to kind of just move the ball a little bit and at least get that preliminary kind of planning engineering done now, so that, if money does become available from the feds from another source, you're what they call a shovel-ready project at that point, right? So you might want to try and just get that work done. Another question that if we do not try and, here's one that came up. If we do not try and seek revenue replacement, do we have to do the calculation? I don't actually know the answer to that. Whether the answer is going to be whether or not the revenue calculation is a required field in the portal. And I don't know whether it is or is not, but I would plan on probably having to do the calculation. And if you want me to kind of talk, well, I'm nervous to say that, but I'm happy to help people kind of, get a handle on what that calculation looks like. There are better people to give you the ins and outs of it, obviously, but it's okay. And here Susan says, yes, you do have to report your interim calculation on the interim report. So you at least you're only gonna have to give the calculation for December 2020, but to do this, you're gonna have to know what was your pre-COVID revenue for the fiscal year prior to COVID. You're gonna have to know what is your calendar year revenue, which is just a pain. I don't know why they did it that way, but your calendar year revenue ending 2020. So you're gonna have to get those numbers ready. And Matt says maybe it's not required. So again, I don't know the answer to that question. One question that I had for you guys. So I know that the Mid-Willamette Valley COG, Council of Governments, is looking at maybe doing, maybe helping some smaller cities, or it could be other cities too, to administer this program, because I think it's challenging, right? For folks who maybe are just like a one-person shop. You've got the, recorder who's also the treasurer, who's also the, responsible for answering the phones, maybe. I mean, that's a lot to kind of put on that person. I'm wondering, so I know that that COG is maybe looking at doing some of this work. Do you guys know other people around the state? Has anybody else looked at contracting out administration of this program? Certainly, administrative expenses are allowed to be claimed as an ARPA expense, right? So if you are administering let's just say a rent support program, the time that person spends on that program is allowed as an expense in that category as rent support. Similarly, if you had to reach out to your attorney, right? I think that you could probably claim that in that category as rent support as an administrative cost. They have to be reasonable and proportional, but generally administrative costs are allowed. Has anybody looked at contracting this out? Not really seeing anything. I see Dawn's interested, and I, the person who asked me about this was a mayor, and he's like, we're actually between recorders / city administrators right now. So I'm going to keep an eye out for that, but like I said, I know that, Mid-Willamette Valley COG is looking at it. I've told people to maybe talk to, so it looks like City of Oregon City offers some services for a fee. I've told people to kind of talk to neighboring cities and see if they might be willing to take something on, or to the county, right? I think that the county maybe is, at least in one case that I'm aware of, administering a program for a city. So that might be a conversation that you could have as well. But, okay, and so here's a question. For a city of 8,000, what's involved with the interim report due October 31st? So first of all, let's make sure we're on the same thing here. So for a city of 8,000, you're going to be a non-entitlement unit of government. So you're not, you don't have to do the interim report. That's the one that's actually due August 31st. But the report that you're going to have to do October 31st, the rules are not out yet, right? So like I said, we have this user guide that came out for how to do the interim report. There's going to be a similar guide that's going to tell you how you do what they call the project and expenditure report. If you look right now in the guidance document, it talks a little bit about what will be required. I think it starts on page 11, if I recall. So there's some information there right now, but there's going to be a more detailed user guide for how it is that you actually fill out what they call that project and expenditure report that's due out in October. So we're expecting a little more guidance there. It's possible that the final rule could get changed a little bit. I know they took comments through mid-July, so we're kind of waiting to see too whether they adopted any changes to the interim final rule based off of comments. So, you know, this is still kind of a moving target, and just because I'm saying it's true today, right, on the 24th of August, doesn't mean that it's true if you're watching this in December. The guidance may have changed a little bit since this time. Any other thoughts folks would like to share? You know, I'm happy to stay on as long as possible. We're scheduled to end here in a few minutes, and you know, and I want to respect people's time. But if any of you have experiences that you'd like to share, I'd love to hear it. If you're a brave soul and want to put that out there. All right. Well, listen. I think we're there, and I really, really appreciate everybody joining us. We had great turnout today, and I know that, you know, you folks are very serious about you know, doing this the right way, following all the rules, you know, dotting our I's, crossing our T's, and I know that you guys are going to do great things for your communities. You know, this is you know, a real opportunity for us. This kind of money does not come around every day. And, you know, and you've been given this heavy burden to figure out how to properly, you know, use these resources, but it's also just a great opportunity, you know, and really, I would encourage people to think big, you know, can you do things to leverage the funds, you know, maybe, you know, you can do something that will increase employment, you know, by your actions, and, you know, and will have kind of an effect that will bring money into the city for years to come. You know, maybe you can invest in a piece of infrastructure that's going to be there, you know, 20, 30 years after you're gone. So this is a real opportunity for us. And, you know, and I've talked to so many of you, and anytime you need to give a call and just kind of bounce things off of me, I'll always say, talk to your attorney, but I'm always happy to tell you, you know, what I've seen in the guidance and share that. You know, I know that you folks are working really hard on this, and I really appreciate that. And I am especially sympathetic to folks who are in these really, really small towns, you know, without a lot of support. So anytime you want to call and just kind of bounce things off me, feel free. Really, really appreciate you taking the time today. And thank you for the thank yous. And again, feel free to reach out. We'll post the PowerPoint and a recording of the video soon. But I really appreciate all your time today. Thanks, everyone.